Thanks, Laura. This is sitting at home and reading. It's always nice to know that George Catlin brings people out, even after, I don't know, 100 plus years. I'm actually showing you two images at the moment that I'm really not going to talk about, but one is a painting by George Catlin here. This is a painting by Carl Bodmer here. Both of Matutopa, who was the second chief of the Mandan, both painters actually, in kind of succeeding years, met with Matutopa, who actually also did his own portrait for Mr. Bodmer, which is actually located in the Jocelyn Art Museum in Omaha, which I just had the great pleasure to see recently. What I'm going to do is actually pretty much read the first part of this talk because it's a number of different facts that I have trouble keeping straight in my own mind, so just an easier way to do this. And then the second half of the talk actually will be a little bit more freeform when we start dealing with the objects. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
On May 19, 1879, a freight car loaded with George Catlin's paintings of American Indians, some 450 plus, along with 4 boxes of American Indian material, made its way from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., to be taken possession of by the Smithsonian. It was a gift to the nation from Mrs. Joseph Harrison, who was the widow of Joseph Harrison, Jr., the gentleman who rescued George Catlin from his creditors in London in 1852. This, however, was not the end of the Catlin presence in Philadelphia, where a few paintings and much ethnographic material made its way from the Harrison collection into the hands of a few Philadelphia collectors of American Indian material, and subsequently into the collections of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. I will focus in this talk on this heretofore neglected portion of the Catlin collection. That is, George Catlin's actual collection of American Indian objects made during his 5 trips to the West between 1830 and 1836. The first half of the talk will attempt to chart the routes that the Catlin collection took and shed some light on some of the gray area of the collection's history from its arrival in Philadelphia in 1853 until its partial dispersal to Washington in 1879, and finally its remaining dispersal to the University of Pennsylvania Museum in 1901 and 1945. In the second half of the talk, we'll take a look at some of the actual objects that Catlin collected. Mostly on screen, but as Loa mentioned, I did bring some down from the collections, which you're more than welcome to come and take a look at after we finish. So, George Catlin's Indian Curiosities, a collection saved, hidden, dispersed, discovered. The actors in our drama. In order of their appearance, George Catlin. This is a portrait painted by Fisk, which is now in the National Museum of American Art in D.C. George Catlin, artist, collector, showman. Joseph Harrison, Jr., wealthy Philadelphia art patron, savior. Colonel Thomas Corwin Donaldson, raconteur, collector. And Charles H. Stevens, artist, collector. George Catlin was born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania on July 26, 1796. He was trained in the law and was admitted to the bar in Connecticut. His love, however, was painting, and by 1821 he was living in Philadelphia, where he began exhibiting at the Academy of Fine Arts. Catlin remained in Philadelphia for probably 4 years, during which time he undoubtedly came under the influence of artists like Thomas Sully and John Nagel. He also had access to the leading natural scientists of the day who worked through institutions such as the American Philosophical Society. There was also Charles Wilson Peale's museum at the State House, Independence Hall. And here is a print showing Mr. Peale's museum on the 2nd floor of Independence Hall. Catlin also saw a number of Indian delegations that passed through Philadelphia on their way to Washington. His Philadelphia experience provided fertile ground for someone whose sight was turning toward the unexplored West. By 1826, Catlin had moved to New York City, where he also pursued his painting. That same year, he disclosed to a fellow painter, George Harvey, his desire to become the historian and painter of the native peoples of North America. By 1829, Catlin, completely disillusioned with portrait and miniature painting, the reviews of his work were not favorable. He felt that he was wasting his life and talents. He wrote to General Peter Porter, who was the Secretary of War, and asked to be appointed to a professorship of drawing at West Point, or to be sent to some Indian agency in the West where he could pursue his goal of painting native peoples. It has been suggested that, in fact, Catlin realized that he would never be able to compete with many portrait painters working in New York, Philadelphia, and/or Boston, who were much better artists than he, and that he saw the opportunity to travel the West and paint Indians as a chance to remove himself from the confines of conventional artistic career. He would use his artistic talents to record a vanishing race. This alone would place him beyond the power of art critics. This is a portrait of William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame, who was superintendent of Indian Affairs, based in St. Louis, and the man that everyone needed to speak to before heading out to visit any of the native peoples beyond the Mississippi. There's a couple of maps, actually, one showing the United States in 1804 after the Louisiana Purchase, and then the location of Native American nations at that point in time. So these would be the people that Mr. Catlin would be encountering on his trip up the Missouri River. George Catlin made 5 trips to the West between 1830 and 1836. And basically, this is the route that Lewis and Clark followed, but this is the same route that George Catlin took, same route that Carl Bodmer took a couple of years after George Catlin, following from St. Louis up the Missouri in through Montana to the base of the Rocky Mountains. Catlin's modus operandi was to spend a season of intensive field work, during which he would briefly sketch dozens of portraits and then spend the rest of the year back in his studio finishing them. During his 1832 trip to Fort Union, for example, it is estimated that his production was 170 paintings in 5 months. This would be nearly an impossible figure if it were not for the fact that these were sketches done in the field to be finished later. In addition to the paintings, of course, these were the trips on which Catlin made his extensive collection of Indian objects. In his own words, quote, "a very extensive and curious collection of their costumes and all their other manufactures, from the size of a wigwam down to the size of a quill or rattle." These are a couple of images, actually, of some of Catlin's trips. This is St. Louis, his beginning of his trip up the Missouri. This is the point at which, this is Dougherty's agency, the point at which Omaha, Nebraska is now. Scenes of various sites in the upper Missouri, including the Mandan villages, Hidatsa villages, Lakota villages, and some of the individuals that Catlin painted from those trips to the upper plains. He also did one trip to the lower plains into what is now Oklahoma. Comanche people's Choctaw individuals playing lacrosse. Having completed his first set of travels by 1836, Catlin began his second set. These travels involved exhibiting his paintings of Indians, fleshed out with objects of their manufacture, what he called his Indian gallery, to the citizens of the still new nation who had never seen what their Wild West was like. In late 1837, he opened the Indian Gallery in New York City to astonished praise. He followed this by trips to Washington, D.C., and here's the broadside from Washington, where he had hoped that the government would actually be interested in buying his collection for $65,000. He also made trips to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Boston. When Congress did not act on purchasing his collection, Catlin threatened to take his Indian gallery to Europe. He set sail for England in 1839, hoping that foreign acclaim would aid his case in selling the collection to the United States. Catlin opened his Indian Gallery in London in 1840 to great success. And here's the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly and broadside from his London production. This is Catlin's nephew, who was dressed as probably a prairie individual. This was part of his Indian gallery, actually, was the performance of Indian dances. And at first, at least for his American tour, he actually utilized members of his own family to perform those dances. That's the way he began in London, but then quickly brought in a group of Ojibwa and a group of Iowa to London, who then traveled to Paris also to actually do the performances. So here we have the Ojibwas and the Iowas in London. In 1845, he moved his Indian Gallery to Paris to initial success, but he was back in London in 1848. And here again, images of the Indian Gallery in Paris, including this very large crow teepee, and the Ojibwas and the Iowas meeting French and Belgian royalty. These are prints of his own. The whole European venture, as well as his American tour, was underwritten by Catlin himself. He relied on the revenue generated by ticket sales to pay his bills and to provide a living for himself and his family. Catlin was still hoping for the purchase of his collection by the U.S. government. This hope, however, was finally dashed when the Senate rejected the purchase by one vote by the end of the decade of the 1840s. With the decrease in the public's interest and the subsequent loss of revenue, everything collapsed in 1852, and George Catlin was brought to the brink of bankruptcy. His creditors closed in, and everything was set to be auctioned. At this point, our second major actor enters the picture, one Joseph Harrison Jr. Joseph Harrison Jr., born in Philadelphia in 1810, had as a young man established a reputation for himself as a builder of locomotives. He attracted the attention of Russian engineers, and in 1843, Harrison and his partners contracted with the Russian imperial government to build 162 locomotives and 2,500 freight cars for the St. Petersburg to Moscow Railroad. Harrison lived in St. Petersburg from 1843 until 1850 and became an extremely wealthy man. After leaving Russia, he spent the next 2 years primarily in London and Paris before returning to Philadelphia. Joseph Harrison had met Catlin in London and had undoubtedly seen his Indian Gallery. Catlin, in fact, was the agent through whom Harrison had acquired Benjamin West's famous painting, William Penn's Treaty with the Indians. Joseph Harrison paid off Catlin's debt at a cost of nearly $40,000 and had the paintings and the collection of Indian material packed up and shipped back to Philadelphia, where they promptly were placed in storage. Catlin remarked, "My collection was saved to my country by an American gentleman, an act so noble and patriotic that I cannot believe my country will forget it." Joseph Harrison was also a prominent art collector in Philadelphia. In addition to the Benjamin West that I already mentioned, he acquired a number of canvases by Sully, Cole, Cropsey, Bierstadt, Stewart, more canvases by West, and a number by Charles Wilson Peale, including his famous Artist in His Museum, now at the Museum of American Art at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. As a matter of fact, most of Harrison's painting collection was split up between the Academy of Fine Arts and the Art Museum. Why Harrison neglected the Catlin collection of nearly 500 paintings, plus the collection of Indian material in his possession, while carefully displaying his other paintings in a palatial mansion on Rittenhouse Square, is somewhat of a mystery. Harrison did have some remorse over the matter, however. In a letter from Italy, where he was on the Grand Tour, dated June 1861, and addressed to his eldest son, Harrison wrote, quote, "Unpack and overhaul the Indian collection now in the upper room in the store in Market Street near 8th, and see what condition it is in. I have no doubt that it is quite destroyed with rats, mice, and moth. I ought to have had this attended to long ago, but was so disgusted with Catlin's conduct in the matter that I dislike to think or speak of the matter. There are some things in it that are really valuable, Let the pictures be hung up in the room where the collection now is, and let all that is possible be saved from further destruction. I do not wish this matter to be shown or talked about. I do not feel at all satisfied with myself in the way in which I have neglected the collection for so many years. The room has been locked for years. What this personal rancor between Harrison and Catlin was, we may never know, but it did keep the Catlin collection locked away for nearly a decade. How much of the collection was so badly destroyed that it may have been disposed of is also something we will never know. Perhaps in an attempt to right the wrong he felt he had done by not adequately caring for the Catlin material, Harrison proposed in 1871, in a letter addressed to his fellow members of the Fairmount Park Commission, the establishment of an art gallery and museum in the park. Again, Harrison said, "If we as a nation are to keep pace with the civilization and refinement of the older states of the Christian world, we too must have our free art galleries and museums, owned by, enjoyed by, and cared for by the people." As an inducement, Harrison offered to donate a large Benjamin West painting and all the Catlin canvases. The Park Commission was enthusiastic. The city of Philadelphia was not, and refused to budget the necessary money. Joseph Harrison Jr. died in 1874, 2 years after George Catlin's death, and the Catlin collection still languished in storage. The year 1876, the year of the Centennial Exhibition, brought Thomas Corwin Donaldson to Philadelphia as commissioner for Idaho. He is the third major actor in the Catlin collection saga. Donaldson was born in Ohio in 1843 at the height of Catlin's fame in London. He served with distinction in the Army throughout the Civil War, and afterwards held positions with many government departments, including acting as general agent for the National Museum from 1874 to 1878. He was an ardent collector of anything having to do with the American Indian: books, manuscripts, paintings, objects. He also served as expert special agent of the 11th Census, 1890, in charge of the census of the American Indian population. Donaldson's interest was aroused in 1879 when his attention was brought to the fact that the Catlin collection was in Philadelphia and in private hands. The agent of this information was one John McIlvaine, himself a collector of Indian material and a taxidermist. It was McIlvaine who presumably set up the initial meeting between Donaldson, as agent for the National Museum, and Mrs. Joseph Harrison, widow of Joseph Harrison and executor of his estate. What George Catlin had hoped for in 1837, that the government of the United States would purchase his Indian gallery, finally became a reality in 1879, some 42 years later, when the National Museum accepted as a gift from the Harrison estate the collection that George Catlin had made. Having been stored in different parts of the city, including the Harrison Boiler Works on the east bank of the Schuylkill River, ironically almost exactly across the river from where we are now, the Catlin collection was subjected to vermin damage, as well as, at the Boiler Works, 2 fires and the resultant water damage. When the material was being crated for transport to Washington, a large number of buffalo robes, dresses, shirts, and other costume items were so badly damaged that they were buried in the yard of the Boiler Works. In September 1881, more material was found in a building on Merrick Street near 15th and Market. Objects found there included the Crow Lodge, which went to the Smithsonian, and a variety of clothing, masks, pipes, and moccasins, which had been fastened to the original cloth screens. These too had suffered damage. And here's a view of the Indian Gallery set up at the Smithsonian in 1888. And just for comparative purposes, the Catlin's Indian Gallery in Paris and the way it was set up in Washington. So very, very much in this tradition of 19th century salon style hanging paintings. And actually in, this isn't a good image for this, but there's another one that actually shows some of these cloth screens that hung around the room that actually had material much like you see on the table suspended from the screen, or from the cloth rather. Unlike her husband, Mrs. Harrison apparently did not write letters or keep diaries. Neither are there any papers of Thomas Corwin Donaldson's that appear to have survived, or at least not come to light. Yet there appears to have been some private arrangement made between Mrs. Harrison, Thomas Donaldson, and the original mediator between the two, John McIlvaine. McIlvaine and Donaldson receiving their choice of objects from the Catlin collection as payment for their part in negotiating the transfer of the collection to Washington. John McIlvaine died in 1885, and his Indian collection was auctioned off in Philadelphia in that year. Thomas Corwin Donaldson died in Philadelphia on November 18, 1898. The last 2 decades of the 19th century saw Philadelphia arriving on the National Museum scene with its own Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, known as the Free Museum of Science and Art. Already lagging behind similar institutions on the East Coast, the Smithsonian founded in 1846, Peabody at Harvard in 1866, American Museum of Natural History in New York, 1869. The fledgling museum had much catching up to do in terms of collecting, especially in the area of North America. Some of this was rectified in 1900 and 1901 when Stuart Catlin, with the financial backing of department store magnate John Wanamaker, undertook 2 collecting trips in the Upper Plains, the Northwest Coast, California, and the Southwest in the company of George Dorsey of the Field Museum in Chicago. A golden opportunity presented itself in 1901. In a letter to Robert C.H. Brock, chairman of the Board of Managers of the museum, Catlin wrote, quote, "The exceedingly valuable collection of American antiquities and ethnological objects, the property of the estate of the late Thomas Corwin Donaldson, is offered for sale to the museum. The collections comprise a number of very valuable Mandan buckskin dresses of great interest from the McIlvaine collection, a number of oil paintings of Indians by Catlin, Stanley, Julian Scott, and others, and ethnographic material from many tribes. The collection is well cataloged and is in admirable condition. A remarkable feature is a collection of stone pipes which belong to George Catlin and are figured in his works. The acquisition of this collection would place us in possession of much unique material." Thomas Blaine Donaldson, Thomas Blaine Donaldson, son of Thomas Corwin Donaldson and executor of his estate, expressed in a letter to Catlin that we are desirous, if possible, to have the collection remain in Philadelphia. The collection, or part of it, numbering 518 objects, was purchased in May of 1901 with monies provided by John Wanamaker. In that collection were 8 oil paintings by Catlin, a notebook of his, and 18 objects, including pipe bowls, a pipe stem, quillwork bands, drums, and 2 shields that had belonged to Catlin. The oil paintings and the notebook were deaccessioned from this institution in the 1970s. An exchange with George High in 1908 involved 3 pieces, a shield and 2 Northwest Coast argillite pipes, which are now in the collection of the National Museum of the American Indian. The younger Donaldson also sold off portions of his father's collection before offering it to the Free Museum, now the Pennsylvania Museum, or the Penn Museum, in 1901. We know this because of the incredible record-keeping of the 4th actor in this drama, one Charles H. Stevens. Here shown lounging in a teepee out in Montana. Charles Stevens was a Philadelphian who had studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts under Thomas Akins, and who incidentally was one of the students who turned against Akins in his battle at the Academy over using nude models, which ultimately resulted in Akins' dismissal. He made his living as an illustrator, working a great deal for Lippincott and Company on a number of books they published dealing with Western themes. Stevens was also an avid collector of Indian material. He died in 1931. When his collection of 1,400 objects came to the museum in 1945, it included note cards with beautifully rendered watercolors of the objects in his collection on the one side of the card, and on the reverse, detailed information as to provenance, date purchased, and price paid. Approximately 50 objects, about half of those being arrows, in the Stevens collection were from the Catlin collection, and all had been in Thomas Corwin Donaldson's collection. These Catlin objects were purchased by Stevens from 2 sources: Charles Osborne, who was a local dealer in Philadelphia and Atlantic City, who ran Osborne's Ye Olde Curiosity Shop, and Dr. W.W. McClure, who was a local collector. The purchases from Osborne were made in 1899, a year after the elder Donaldson's death, and 2 years before the Donaldson collection was offered to this museum. The purchases from McClure did not occur until 1907. One has to wonder if indeed there was not other Catlin material that was sold off by the younger Donaldson that disappeared into other local collections where all trace of its provenance had vanished. The younger Donaldson also held back portions of his father's collection that he did not sell to the museum. In 1909, George Hyde purchased 6 objects from Thomas Blaine Donaldson, all from the Catlin collection, 4 pipes, a shield, and a bow. Again, one has to wonder, even at this late date of 1909, if the younger Donaldson were still not holding back or still holding on to some original Catlin material that has since been lost into other collections. And here's just a series of some of these beautiful catalog cards that were done by Charles Stevens. And actually, we do have a copy of one of the cards up here, which we'll see in a moment. It's a series of pipe stems. These are all Catlin pipe stems that he drew. The American Indian objects that George Catlin collected are currently housed in 4 institutions. And these are objects that carry with them the Catlin provenance. There are probably others that have lost that provenance. These institutions are the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, the recipient of the original 1879 gift, the National Museum of the American Indian, formerly the Museum of the American Indian, which received material and trade from the University of Pennsylvania Museum in 1908, and by purchase from Thomas Donaldson's son in 1909. The University of Pennsylvania Museum, which received material in 1901 and 1945, and the Peabody Museum at Harvard, which received some Catlin pieces from the Smithsonian in 1888. That concludes the red portion of the presentation. See how we're doing for time here, because I will speed this up so you can actually look at some of these objects. First, I'll show a number of objects, pipe bowls, in the collection, that are in our collection, which tended not to be, and I should say this kind of up front, which I haven't said yet, but there are 2 really interesting things about this collection. One is that it is Catlin material collected between 1830 and 1836. The reality is there are not that many old collections of Upper Plains material with that kind of date. I mean, we can guess at the date, but we don't have that kind of collection data. But more interestingly, I think, is the fact that in this collection, and this holds true for the material at the National Museum of the American Indian, and for the museum, or for the collection that's at Natural History in Washington, D.C., that some of these objects have been reworked. And it's my opinion, and a couple of other people I've talked to who know older material, that in fact, these things were probably reworked by George Catlin himself, so that they would have been used in performance. And we'll see a couple of examples in the slides of a couple of pieces of clothing that have definitely been reworked, which are down in Washington. And I pulled out actually some of the pieces here that have been reworked so you can get an idea of them. First, we're going to look at, very quickly, the pipe bowls here at the museum. Catlin had a tendency to take his original drawings, which were pretty much a one-to-one correspondence, and then in the later iterations of those drawings, turned them into much more Baroque-looking things. So, for many of the objects he collected from the Northern Plains peoples, you can kind of see the basic form in the image that Catlin painted or drew afterwards, but it takes on, they become much more fussy. The drawing of pipes from the 1830s, and this is the plate from his Manners and Customs book, and I have volume 2, which is sitting there on the table for other reasons. This is a pipe in our collection of the same type. There are probably about 6 or 7 of these pipe bowls in existence, and it's called the White Indian facing off against the white man, which I think is kind of interesting. And this guy is probably represented with this drawing here. And this is a series of our pipe bowls here against this plate which appears in the 1841 edition of Manners and Customs. The pipe bowl with the bear, which appears, I know you're here, right there. Done on the steed type. The horsehead pipe, which is this one here. This is a pipe that's typical of the lakes region, so western Great Lakes, which is this guy right here. And then this kind of typical flared out bowl portion of the pipe with the prow, which is a pre-1850s rendition of pipes. After 1850, this portion becomes much more, doesn't flare out at all, but much more conical in shape. And then this guy right here. And then just another series of Catlinite pipes bearing the Catlin provenance, but not depicted necessarily in that plate. This one's kind of interesting. The poor animal is gone. His paws are still there. His tail attachment is there, but the rest is gone. First, I was going to look at some unaltered pipe stems in our collection here, and there are a couple. And here's an example of Old Bear, who's a medicine man, Mandate medicine man, holding these very typical kind of calumets. These two are intact pieces from the Peabody Harbor. Another one from the Peabody Harbor here, and these are the ones that we have, which have been unaltered, but as you can see, all of anything that was attached to these pipes has been, well, in this case, eaten away, which is direct evidence of the way they were improperly stored for the better part of the latter half of the 19th century in a warehouse. Buffalo Bull's fat back, showing the typical decorated upper portion of the 1830s pipe stem, and a pipe stem from our collection, which is kind of the unpainted portion on your right, would have been the area, actually the painted portion, I'm sorry, on the left, would have been the area that had undoubtedly decorated quill work as part of it, much like you see here, and like you see on some of the pipe stems on the table. This is a pipe stem that's actually here, which shows this kind of upper portion. A lot of the quill work missing. And another one which is here. This is probably one of the most amazing untouched pipe stems from the Northern Plains from the 1830s. You'll have to see it in the flesh to kind of appreciate the fineness of the carving of this piece. I mean, it's just, which was very, very typical of pipe stems from this time period. I don't want to use the word elegant, but they were very elegant and very sparse, except for the quill decoration and usually the pendant dyed horsehair. And just a couple more. This shows a detail of some of the quill work bands here. Here, interestingly, overpainted, and I don't know when that happened, but it seems to have been done after the pieces had left, after they left the Harrison's possession, when they would have been completely destroyed. And on the underside of some of these pipe stems, actually, when you flip them, you can see all the quill work eaten away. And yet again, a couple other images. Now, interestingly, we come to the altered pipe stems in this museum collection. Here's the black moccasin, Hidatsa, and you can see that whole lower portion of his pipe stem. This would be the classic decoration up at the top. The whole lower portion at this point is decorated. And I think it was more a case of actually Catlin having decorated the pipe stems and then gone back when he finished the paintings to actually add that decoration to the painting rather than vice versa. Again, another, the 1841 plate, and here's one from Monograph in the British Museum, showing this kind of really curious decorative, pictographic style, which was very atypical of pipe stems from the 1830s. Then we get into even kind of crazier kind of snakes with an arrow tongue, which this is hot filed or burnt into the surface of the flint or the pipe bone, or pipe stem rather. In this version, painted. And very un-Indian-like motifs. Here, a beautiful example of an early pipe that's really been quite doctored, including this kind of Thunderbird image, which again, you can find a one-to-one correspondence in Catlin's actually paintings and in the 1841 book. Same image appears on the reverse of a drum that's also in our collection. And then it's actually very strange kind of depiction of buffalo heads. And this is my favorite because it is so strange. This image of this is a carved out image of an Indian, and very, again, atypical designs for this type of object at that time period. A couple of close-ups of that piece. This is probably one of the most amazing pipe stems, again, which is on the table. Again, showing this, this strange buffalo head and actually buffalo tracks in this case. Some detail of the quill work, which is amazing quill work, which is the style of quill work that accompanies all of these early pieces. With actually, there's a human figure here done in blue, which is a little bit, he's disappearing, but he's also astride a horse on this one. So it's very fugitive blue that was used. Say, with stuff like this, there was no reason to paint the bottom of the pipe stem, basically, except for the fact that it makes it. My guess is that because I haven't been able to find anything in Catlin's writings about him actually doing this, but it was almost as if those objects were too elegant to have been created by Native Americans, so he had to make them look more Indian. And my suspicion is that these were pieces that were actually, as I said, used in performance, and actually would probably read very well in performance from a distance, because they, like an Impressionist painting, they kind of fall apart when you see them up close. Some other objects, Catlin objects in our collections, amazing quill work. This is all loom woven quill work. These pieces are actually on the table. That last piece I showed you, this is an object, this is a bag, which is not from Catlin, but this is the same kind of piece that would have been attached on the bag. So there are bits and pieces of things. These two strips of quill work would probably have been appended to things like shoulders on the coat. Rondelles, here is that drum, the buffalo head, and the reverse. A couple of other drums, a shield from the Comanche, which again shows the extensive damage that was done to these objects when they lived in bad storage conditions. Unlike the Plains material, Catlin did not rework other images that he published in the 1841 book. And as an example, we have this mask, which is in our collection, which came in the Stevens purchase in 1945. This mask is probably Tsimshian. It was in Catlin's collection, and this is from the plate from his 1841 book, which is actually sitting on the table. Along with other Northwest Coast items. We don't know where he got his Northwest Coast collections. But it's interesting because the majority of Catlin pieces that exist down in Washington are actually Northwest Coast pieces. And the material that they traded off to the Peabody Harvard is all Northwest Coast pieces. So the bulk of the remaining Catlin material actually is Northwest Coast, not Plains, which is kind of interesting. But we don't know where he got them. On Stephen's card, it reads that this was probably in the collection of William Clark in his museum. But the existing inventories from Clark's museum don't list any Northwest Coast pieces. So that's kind of a mystery that's unsolved yet. This is actually the piece in question. You can see here there's a one-to-one correspondence between the face painting here and the way it renders the actual object's face painting. And that object is actually on the table. This is Charles Stevens' card with the same image. And this is a really phenomenal drawing here done by George Bucher, who's Will Bucher's dad, of this piece. And I'll invite you all to come up and take a look at those because they're all four of those are together. The 1841, well, the object, the 1841 depiction of the object, Stevens' depiction of the object from the early 19th century, or the early 20th century, and then George Bucher's. And there they are. Well, they're all sitting up on the table. Very quickly, Catlin material and other institutions. This is Matatope again, and this is supposedly Matatope's shirt, which Catlin collected, which is a complete pastiche of objects. This is the way a shirt of that period should appear, both in terms of length and in terms of decoration. And if you see the two of these together, this is actually, I'm sorry to say I don't recall where it's from at the moment, but this is the Matatope piece, which is in Washington, along with kind of very curious pictographic painting that mimics this style, but isn't. And this has the addition of actually these kinds of things off of bags that were attached. So Catlin was kind of doctoring all kinds of objects for, again, for performance. This cradle is in Washington, from the Great Lakes area. Flute, two bags here, one parfleche, and then a very strange Great Lakes style bag, which is a twined bag with the addition of rawhide fringe, which is very atypical for that kind of bag. So again, something Catlin probably cobbled together. These, again, this is the 1841 plate from the 1841 Manners and Customs. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get photographs of these pieces. But these two argillite pipes at the bottom, which are a little bit of a blow up here, these were originally in our collection, came in 1901, and these were traded off to George High in 1908. So those two pieces are now at the National Museum of the American Indian. And stranger still, this is an example of at least one piece, and I suspect there are many more, as I said. Pieces from Catlin's collection that were in Donaldson's collection that ultimately traveled out into private hands. This is a shield, which again probably has, this is probably overpainting, and possibly done by Catlin. This was in the hands of a local collector in the early 20th century, Earl Horder, who had a vast collection of Plains material. And it appears on one of his inventories here from the 1938, I believe, or 1939. The shield actually was in Charles Stevens' collection. And somehow it maneuvered out of Charles Stevens' collection after his death in 1931 and into Earl Horder's collection. He died in 1940. There's the shield in question on Stevens' catalog card. And we know that I'm actually working on a catalog of this material with a colleague at the Smithsonian, Joellen Archambault, a Lakota anthropologist. And she found out in the last couple of years from another colleague of hers that in fact, who ran across a letter from Catlin to someone, which is housed in a repository in London, that where he states that because of revenues being down and creditors closing in, he was selling Indian material off from his collection in London. So we at least have written evidence that material did leave his collection and entered European collections. Again, whether they're carrying with them this kind of Catlin provenance or not, we just don't know. But my suspicion is that there's probably a lot more Catlin material floating out there in private hands that we'll never be able to pinpoint. Although we may be able to use, something like this kind of over a reworking of stems as a diagnostic feature. And that said, that's the story of the collection.